Hello and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. My name is Dan Gibson, and in this video we're going to investigate the gods that were worshipped in Arabia at the time of the coming of Islam. First, Bukhari tells us that when Muhammad entered the Kaaba to cleanse it, there were 360 sacred objects gathered there. The Arabic word here is nusub, or standing objects. Some of them were idols, I'm sure, but many of them were simply religious objects. For instance, there were pictures of Jesus and his Mary Mother. This picture is from the 15th century, about the same time that the event took place. In Christianity, artistic drawings of religious people were not forbidden. In fact, they were encouraged. It helped people to remember and identify the biblical stories and the people that were there. So these pictures were not idols, but they were religious objects, and the records call them nusub, or standing objects. 360 religious objects. The first question we must ask is, how did all of these objects get collected in the Kaaba area? How could Christians, Jews, pagans, all of them allow their sacred objects to be gathered in the same place? It doesn't make sense. I do not know of any other place that this phenomena has occurred. But if you believe that the first Kaaba was in the city of Petra, then there is a reasonable explanation. You see, Petra was home to pagans, Jews, and Christians. There were at least 4 churches in the Christian quarter of Petra, but the Christians only occupied a small part of that city. The rest of the city was full of pagans, polytheists, and their places of worship. Then, 19 years before Muhammad was born, a large earthquake shook Petra, crushing many buildings and causing them to collapse, including the churches. After the earthquake, the citizens of Petra dug through the rubble, and they retrieved the religious objects. But what should they do with them? The temples had collapsed. Now, in Petra, there was an open area in front of the main temple, today known as Qasr al-Bint. And as we discovered in the last video, back then it was most likely the temple to Hubal, or the Lord Dushera of the Dushera Mountains. And in that open area in front of that temple, nothing could fall on these precious sacred objects. Now today, archaeologists and historians are eager to establish the identity of the god that was worshipped in each of these temples. That is, assuming there was an individual god worshipped with each temple. I think that concept is based on the Roman and Greek practice. They often had a temple for each individual god. However, there is no evidence that the early Arabs limited their temples to just one deity. All of the temples seem to have niches and places for multiple idols. And so it would seem that there were multiple idols worshipped in each of these temples. In a few minutes, we will list some of these gods, and you will notice that from the earliest mention of these gods, they all came from the Lihanite inscriptions. Almost every one of them has roots back to Lihanite nomads. Nomads do not have temples unless it's a place where they go on pilgrimage. Nomads worship where they are. And so the idea of a fixed, permanent building for just one god doesn't fit the nomad mindset. And so it is very common to find god niches and inscriptions of various gods side by side in sacred space. Sometimes, even inside the same niche, you find multiple gods. So when the earthquake took place in Petra in 519 AD, the Arabs had no objection in gathering all the religious objects of the city into one location. What is surprising is to find objects from one of the 4 churches placed alongside of the idols. But this is what we're told. This is why you find stories of people digging through the rubble and finding sacred writings about Allah and Mecca. This is why they had to find a Jewish rabbi to translate them, and why these objects were placed side by side, Christian and pagan. And so in 551, after the earthquake, all of the people that survived the earthquake gathered in the open space in the center of the city beside Qasr al-Bint. It was here that they collected all of their religious objects. Christians would be there, pagans would be there, and each one would pray in front of their own object. Some would walk in a circle and pray in front of many objects, and others would call out the names of their deity as they would walk past. So, what were the main gods that were worshipped before the coming of Islam? In the previous video, we identified Hubal as being the main god of the Quraysh, and we identified that god with Dushera, or one of the Shera mountains. We also connected Hubal with the name Hubail. We demonstrated that this god was also known as Baal Shaman. What is interesting is that Baal Shaman had other names given to him. One of those was Rahman, or merciful. Another name was Blessed be his name forever. Over 200 altars have been found in northern Arabia with this title. Along with Rahman, the merciful, there was the title Tib, from where we get our word Tayyib, or good. Other titles were Hanan, or compassionate, where we get Hanun from. SKR, you see written in the inscriptions. Reward, or generous. These are all applied to Baal Shaman. Now, the next god we want to look at is Alat. Some call her a moon god. She also started out as the Elehnite god, and some think she was associated with the South Arabian god Wad, as they are found together in at least one inscription. In another place, in Ain Shalal, the name Alat is combined with a crescent symbol. There was a temple to Alat in Iram, which we know as the old ruined town in Wadi Rum. The temple of Alat stands there, and the town stands there, surrounded by steep mountain cliffs. It appears that there was a short, low wall across the opening, so that people were protected behind in the city, and the surrounding cliffs were around them, giving the place the name Encircled, or Ta'if. After the Romans arrived, Alat later came to be identified with Athena of the Greeks, and took on a military aspect. Next we look at Al-Uzza, the mighty. The god known as Al-Uzza, the mighty, started also as a North Arabian deity like the many other gods originally found in Lehianite inscriptions. After the Romans annexed Petra, another aspect was added to that god, that of fertility. Many experts, such as Dr. Zaydin, believe that Al-Uzza was associated as Aphrodite, the fertility goddess, and was worshipped as one of the goddesses of Qasr al-Bint. If this is so, then it's easy to conclude that Qasr al-Bint is the temple of the Aphrodite, which is referred to in the Babatha letters found in the Cave of Letters. Dr. Zaydin has suggested that the modern title of the temple, which is Qasr al-Bint, or the girl's castle, alludes to the association with Aphrodite, or the Al-Uzza in the past. Now there's also mention of Al-Uzza in the Sinai. Jerome wrote the book, the writing called The Life of Hilarion, in which he speaks of a temple and festivals being held in the Sinai in the temple of Al-Uzza around 400 AD. Most likely the city named Al-Uzza got its name from the god Al-Uzza. Now let's move on to the goddess Al-Manat, the goddess of fate. Her name, Manat, comes from an ancient Semitic word that can be found in Old Hebrew, where it means to count or to measure. Again, the name of this god is known to us from Lehianite inscriptions and graffiti. It comes from the root MNWY, which means fate or by lot. This god is known in personal names as well. Manat is found in inscriptions in Dedan and also in Hegra, later appears in Palmyra, and she seems to have made its way through the Roman army all the way up to Hungary. Of course, being a goddess of fate would have been popular among soldiers who gambled a lot, and so the name moved among gamblers. Anywhere where games of chance took place, Manat would have been the logical god to call upon. Back in 2002, when I attended the second annual conference of Nabatean Studies, Dr. Bilal Hirstat of the Hashemite University presented a paper that introduced to the conference various game boards that were found in ancient Petra. That opened my eyes to an entirely new aspect of Petra, and I began to search through Petra and other Nabatean sites to discover these games and to try and find out what they were and how were they played. In those days, I had a free pass from the government to go in and out of the city of Petra, and over the course of 4 years, I made over 50 trips into that city. I studied every aspect of it altogether. I made over 60, maybe 70 trips in and out of Petra over the years. So instead of looking up at marvelous monuments, we kept our heads down and we scoured and we looked at the ground. It was exciting to visit Petra because game boards started popping up all over the place. Then I visited other Nabatean sites looking for game boards, and I found many there. Then I began asking my Bedouin friends if they knew how the games were played, and eventually I wrote a paper about the games. At that time, I was just beginning to see Petra in a different light. It appeared to me that all over the city there were various gambling spots. Most anywhere you were not far from a place where a game of chance was being held. And so you can imagine how important it would be to be in good standing with Manat, the goddess of chance. Here is an ancient game board. It is a series of holes carved in the rock. Notice the bottle cap for size comparison. And here are two different game boards side by side in another spot. Now this game board is close to the der, or the monastery. So you can find these game boards all over Petra. This one is from near the urn tomb. These games are all over, but many of them are now very faded. Al-Kelbi's Book of Idols specifically tells us that Manat devotees used to go on pilgrimage with everyone else, but for them the pilgrimage was not complete until they visited her and shaved their heads in her presence. Once the Prophet Muhammad took control of the holy city, the goddess Manat was destroyed, along with all the other idols. Ibn al-Kalbi tells us that the Prophet sent Ali to destroy Manat, and he removed 2 swords which had been dedicated to her. Next we come to Al-Qutbi, the god of writing. Again, we know Al-Qutbi from Lihyanite inscriptions, where he is known as Al-Qutba. Dr. John Healy tells us that there is an inscription in Petra that refers to Al-Qutba of Gaia, an area just outside of Petra. Another inscription from Tel Ashakaliya in Egypt tells of a temple dedication to Al-Qutba. This is in Egypt and was dated to the 1st century BC. Now, why would you have a god of writing? I like to think that writing would be like magic to those who were illiterate. You see, you could do all kinds of things with writing. If you were a merchant, writing was important. And as we studied the Nabatean situation, it becomes obvious that many Nabatean merchants were skilled in reading multiple languages or using multiple scripts for the same language. Diodorus tells us that the Nabatean merchants would leave writings and directions in the desert that only they could read. Having a secret script that outsiders could not read was a very powerful thing, and so Al-Qutbi became an important god to be able to call upon. Next is the god Al-Qawm, the god of war or protection. The full name of this god was Sheh Al-Qawm. He first appears to have had a specific role in the protection of caravans. This would have been very useful to Nabatean merchants who travel throughout the Middle East. And the name is quite well known in Safavidic graffiti. Dedications to Al-Kaum can be found from Madat and Salah in Saudi Arabia all the way up to Hauran in northern Jordan. In Palmyra, there's an inscription mentioning Kaum, the good and bountiful God who does not drink wine. This gives us a clue that the followers of Al-Kaum did not drink wine. This abstinence from wine is also mentioned by the ancient historian Diodorus, who said, "They live in the open air, claiming as native land the wilderness that has neither rivers nor abundant springs from which it is possible for an hostile army to obtain water. It is their custom to neither plant grain or to set out fruit-bearing trees or to use wine. If anyone is found acting contrary to this, death is his penalty." So we've covered 6 important gods in pre-Islamic times. There are 16 other gods that we could talk about, but they were mostly local gods for small areas, and only a few inscriptions or graffiti are found for each of these. Altogether, we know of about 30 or 40 gods that might have been worshipped in the pagan Kaaba area. This means that there were multiple sacred objects for many of these standing objects that were there. There couldn't have been 360 different idols, but probably 360 sacred things that were there representing all of these different gods. Perhaps there were household idols, so there would have been larger ones and smaller ones that would have been gathered up out of the rubble from the earthquake. In the end, though, 360 objects were gathered in the open air near the Kaaba. Now, where did all of these gods come from? Here is where many people make assumptions. They assume that the Nabateans had a pantheon of gods like the Romans and the Greeks. And they take what we understand of those civilizations and then they apply it on the Nabateans. But the Nabateans were merchants who traveled far and wide. In their travels, they came in contact with many gods, and it became apparent to them that there were different gods in Egypt than there were gods in Rome or gods in Babylon and so forth. Even the Jews had their own gods. So the Nabateans didn't necessarily adapt these gods. They never stopped people from building temples and altars and so forth in their cities. So an Egyptian who was now living in Petra could put up some sacred motive to the god Isis, or Isis as was probably pronounced, and nobody would mind if he was worshipping his god. You see, the Nabateans didn't necessarily have a pantheon or a group of gods they worshipped. They recognized gods of different locations. The Egyptians had their gods, and the Romans had their gods, and this is even found within the gods that the Nabateans worshipped. When looking at the different gods that are mentioned in the ancient descriptions in graffiti, Dr. John Healy noticed that the god Alat and Al-Luza were never found in the same location. They were worshipped in different places. And many times when a god is mentioned, there is a note attached that this god is from a specific location. For instance, in Ain Shalal, there is an inscription beside a niche which refers to Alat, the goddess who is in Basra. Another inscription mentions the great goddess who is in Iram. This reference is to the god in Wadi Rum. When a god is worshipped somewhere else, the reference is often given where the god resides, such as the god in Basra, or the god in Iram, or the god in Al-Hawar, and so forth. And it allowed the Arabs to build temple buildings to have sacred areas that provided worship to multiple gods. It's not just the temple was dedicated and it was restricted to just one god. There were sometimes dedications or mention of several gods in that sacred area. But in 106 AD, everything changed. The Romans now acquired the Nabatean kingdom, and the Roman influence began to come in, and Nabateans began to adopt some of the Roman thought. And so now specific temples were attached to specific gods. So we must look back through the layers of time to understand the pre-Islamic Arabia, how they thought, and then the incoming new Roman Hellenization that was taking place. In Greece and Rome, all the gods were very human. Each of them had gender and faces and were in pictures, and many modern researchers seem to insist that the gods of the Arabs also needed to have gender. And they have assigned some as male and some as female. They suggest that some are wives or some gods, or some are mothers of other gods. And all of this has to do with pantheons. Well, the god gender was never a big deal, I don't think, in Arabia, but it was in Europe. And so it appears to me that the idea of gender crept in with Roman annexation. I don't know if there's strong enough evidence to build a whole case on this, but what we see is that the Romans saw gods with having specific gender, not necessarily the Arabs. So now we've come to the end of this video, but not the end of the subject. In our next video, we want to examine how the concept of these gods influenced the coming of Islam. So I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.